All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge Podcast. So, after the New York Mets failed to make the postseason last year or this past season, I expected them that they were going to have some changes for this team, but not the changes that I have seen so far. Okay, we've already seen the Mets trade veteran outfielder Brandon Nimmo to the Texas Rangers, and now in the span of about 24 hours, we've seen closer Edwin Diaz sign with the Los Angeles Dodgers, and All-Star first baseman Pete Alonso sign with the Baltimore Orioles. Now, if you are a fan of the Mets, this is probably a punch in the gut to you, especially with Alonso leaving town. Now, Alonso was the homegrown guy who, along with Nemo, basically expected to finish their careers with the franchise. But of course, that more than likely is very rarely the case. Okay. We just saw Alonso become the Mets franchise leader off of all time in home runs this past season as he surpassed Darryl Strawberry, a mark that had been in place since 1990 when Strawberry last played for the team. And just like it was for Strawberry, Alonso, once he got his record, he was out the door. Now, if you're a Met fan, okay, probably the saddest part about this is that your favorite team never offered Pete Alonso a deal. And it's one of those where, he got 5 years from the Baltimore Orioles. I never believed that the money was the issue for the Mets. The Mets were willing to pay him the money. I think it was the years. And I think it sounds like the Mets were really dug in on not going above 3 years with Pete Alonso. And he got a 5 year offer from the Baltimore Orioles, better long term security for his standpoint. And he took that offer and he's going to be an Oriole now. But for me, on the other aspect of it, if you are the Mets, and I know that Pete Alonso is 31 years of age now, and you're worried about him possibly breaking down defensively, you got a universal DH now. So why not just move him to DH in a couple of years? Just a thought out there. Some people are going to say, and I'll say this too, for right now, if you're the Mets, what was the purpose of spending all of the money on Juan Soto last year? Because you spent all of this money on one of the game's premier players. Juan Soto, after the slow start, still rebounded to have a solid season. He only hit 263, but he did hit 43 home runs. But now you don't have that protection in the lineup for him. Okay, so that's a big thing right there. Um, the Mets, in regards to Edwin Diaz, they reportedly had a 3 year deal on the table for 66 million, and the Dodgers gave him 69. And apparently, the Mets were waiting to see if Diaz came back to give them an opportunity to counter. That was not the case. Diaz took his money and he's leaving LaGuardia in favor of LAX. So it depends on what avenue that you want to take on this, okay? But I feel like if the Mets wanted Diaz, they should have tried to cough up the additional 3 million. But at the same time, if they had a deal on the table, and he just took the Dodgers deal and didn't come back to them, well, what can you do? In 6 years with the Mets, he had 144 saves. He had an ERA of 2.93. Remember, he did miss a full season after that injury in the World Baseball Classic. And it took him some time to get back, had a strong 2025, but when it's all said and done, all of those are now things in the past for Edwin Diaz and the Mets. You got to wonder, and it's starting to come out, okay, because Diaz, they're saying basically sounded like he was in his feelings after the Mets signed Devin Williams for their bullpen. And it's one of those where when the Mets signed Devin Williams, because I'm not moved by that move per se. If you're the Mets, especially after the season we just saw Devin Williams have with the New York Yankees, I said, okay, that move is good. If you're talking about Devin Williams being your setup guy for Edwin Diaz in the ninth, and of course that is no longer the case. Is Devin Williams going to be the Mets closer in the ninth inning, or is he still going to be a setup guy? Is it going to be a bullpen by committee, or and are the Mets going to go out there and try to find somebody else for late innings? Also, aside from Devin Williams getting his deal with the Mets, it also sounds like Edwin Diaz was not thrilled that the team decided to part with pitching coach Jeremy Hefner. A lot of things you could take from that, but nonetheless, we're just at the winter meetings, and if you're a Met fan, what you have seen so far is not pushing the needle for this team in 2026. There's a lot of different ways that you could come at this from. I mean, again, the Mets never gave Pete Alonso an offer. Okay, so I know that there's going to be a lot of upset fans out there. The Mets never gave him an offer. And honestly, you could see the writing on the wall for this from last offseason, because I feel like if the Mets wanted to sign Pete Alonso to a long-term deal, that was the time. And I know they had the extension out there before. I think it was a 7-year deal at some point. I can't remember exactly how much money was involved off the top of my head. And of course, Pete Alonso turned it down, thinking he was going to get a better deal last offseason. And of course, that did not come to fruition. The only teams that Pete Alonso really talked to was the Mets and the Blue Jays. And of course, he came back to the Mets on that front-loaded deal. He had the opportunity to opt out. And basically, you kind of got the feel that this was coming, because if you remember, I don't even think the uniforms were off after the Mets' final game of the season when they lost to the Marlins. And of course, their playoff hopes evaporated completely. I do not like, if you remember, Pete Alonso opted out basically as soon as the Mets season was finished. So that tells me right there that Pete Alonso already had a foot out the door. And again, I think if this deal was going to get done long term, the opportunity for it to have happened would have been last year, because you figure now you got Pete Alonso a year older, okay, and you already know how David Stearns, the Mets president of baseball operations, wasn't willing to go long term with Pete as it was. So now you got a guy who's a year older, still looking for a long term deal. It just wasn't going to work out. Okay, and I'm not here to defend David Stearns either. It's one of those where, again, just like it was with Brandon Nimmo, I feel like all of these guys mentioned, they weren't David Stearns guys. He inherited them, no matter how impactful that they were for this team, no matter how much that the fan base enjoyed and embraced them, and enjoyed watching them. They weren't his guys. But I'll tell you like this: we're still in the early stages of this offseason. There's still plenty of moves that can be made. And if you are the New York Mets, there are still plenty of moves that have to be made. Now, you look at Steve Cohen, the Mets team owner, and of course, he's putting a lot of work into getting that casino out there, at his stadium in Flushing, Queens. And when you think about a casino, one thing that always comes to mind, the house always wins. It's one of those where it's a little bit different when it comes to the baseball team, and I'll tell you why. Because last year we saw Steve Cohen spend a lot of money. The fans came out and supported his team, okay? But of course, the results did not live up to the expectations. So I understand that this team is being retooled for the coming year. I totally see it. But you still have to go out there and give your fan base hope and give them a reason to come out to the ballpark to support your product. So far, the Mets have not done that, okay? Edwin Diaz was beloved. Cue the trumpets, okay? And you know what happens next. Pete Alonso, he was the polar bear, all right? So when you lose fan favorites, when you lose all-time players for a team's roster, it's very tough, to get that back. And I'll tell you like this: it's like the onus is on David Stearns now. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. You expected some changes, and again, it all depends on what avenue that you come from on this. Because again, Steve Cohen spent a ton of bread last year, no postseason for the Mets, and it's one of those where, hey, The guys that have left have been there for several years, and the Mets have not won with them. There's different ways that you could come at this. You could come at this and say, well, they were close last year. Let's try to build off of that and add some players, to get ahead of this thing, or let's somewhat tear this down and start over. I think it's an interesting contrast right now between the big market, big spending team owner and Cohen and the small market minded, albeit even though he's from New York City, in David Stearns, who keeps it close to the chest. I think, in my opinion, and I could be wrong on this, all right, I think the Mets are looking at the fact that they have one of the better farm systems in the majors, and I think they want to attempt to ride that wave with the youngsters going forward. Good luck telling that to a Juan Soto. Good luck telling that to a Francisco Lindor in your lineup. But nonetheless, I think it's going to be an interesting blend. But again, like I said before, if you're a Met fan, there is nothing so far this offseason that has really got your juices flowing. I'll say this though, on the flip side of this, with Edwin Diaz going to the Dodgers, the rich just got richer because we saw the Dodgers last offseason go ham in regards to upgrading their pitching, and their pitching really, showed benefits for them in the postseason this past October. And now you're adding even more depth to your back end of your bullpen. Good luck trying to dethrone the Dodgers, okay? Because they are going to continue to be a force to be reckoned with in baseball. And then you've got the Baltimore Orioles, a team who won the American League East in 2024. They were looking to get back. Of course, they failed to live up to expectations this past season as well. They didn't make the playoffs after that very slow start. And now they've got a proven power hitter in the middle of their lineup. And I'll tell you like this, the folks out there in the left field bleachers at Camden Yards, they're going to catch a lot of balls from Pete Alonso. And I think Pete Alonso is going to have fun hitting at Camden Yards because it is more of a hitter's park than City Field. And I'll tell you like this, Pete Alonso is definitely going to be missed with the Mets in more ways than one. And I think his biggest impact is probably going to be with the fans. And I'll tell you like this, I truly think that Pete Alonso loved New York. I think Pete Alonso loved the fans there. And it's one of those where at the end of the day, it's business. And if the Mets weren't going to give him the best deal that he felt he could get in comparison to Baltimore, and of course, in this case, the Mets never offered him a deal. Hey, you know what? You've got to go where you feel that your bread can be buttered. And if you're Pete Alonso, you feel that your bread was buttered by the Baltimore Orioles. Like I said, there's different ways you could take for this from the Mets. But again, like I said, if you're a Met fan, you really can't be excited with what you've seen so far. All right. Now, on the flip side, when it comes to free agency, if you're a new team for a player and you outbid the team that the player played for, you got to wonder why was the reason why that team, who knows so much about him, especially a homegrown guy, decided to allow him to walk. A lot of things that you could decipher from this. It's one of those, at some point the truth will come out. But again, like I said, I expected the Mets to make changes this offseason. I did not expect those changes to include not seeing Edwin Diaz or not seeing a Pete Alonso on this team. The game 82, how are you doing? And happy Wednesday evening to you. You're saying, I love your podcast. Do you believe, thank you for that first and foremost. Do you believe the Mets can bounce back from the Alonso departure and the Diaz signing? At this point, they have no choice because, I mean, you probably have some Met fans out there, and especially the New York media, that are ready to burn David Stearns in effigy. All right. It's real. You know what I'm saying? Because it's one of those where if you're a Met fan, you've probably been emotionally beaten down by this team for the bulk of its existence. And when Steve Cohen bought the team from the Wilpons about 5 years ago, you got the feeling that, hey, you know what? It wasn't going to be run like the Wilpons ran it before. Things were going to be different. And I will say this, Steve Cohen has shown He's fearless when it comes to going out there and spending money, especially on the guys that he wants. And again, like I said before, I feel like if the Mets had wanted to keep Pete Alonso long term, it would have never gotten to this situation. They would have locked him up before free agency. But I guess they felt like he was not in their long term plans. Okay. Glean from it what you will. But I think the Mets have no choice right now because the onus for the rest of this offseason is going to be on David Stearns to go out there and make some impactful moves. Okay. Maybe the Mets can approach this kind of like how with what we saw from the Yankees last offseason. The Yankees gave a legitimate offer, okay, to Juan Soto to retain him, and they fell just short in that bidding. The Yankees turned that around as far as the money that they would have committed to Soto, and they went out there and filled several voids on that team. Now, if you're the Mets, clearly you now have a void at first base. Again, I don't think Devin Williams is the long term answer for the Mets as far as the ninth inning goes. You got to go out there and get somebody else for your bullpen. You definitely need starting pitching. You definitely need an outfielder. So if you're the Mets, you got to try to find a way with the money that you didn't commit to Diaz or Pete Alonso. You've got to go out there and fill multiple voids on your team. You got to look at it like this: how can we keep up with the Joneses in the National League East? The Phillies just re-signed Kyle Schwarber, 5 years, $150 million, a deal that was basically in line with what we saw Pete Alonso get from Baltimore. You have to expect the Braves to bounce back. The Miami Marlins are young and improving, okay? And then you've got the Washington Nationals. And I think the Nationals are still going to be a work in progress. But nonetheless, these are the teams that you have to compete with if you're going to win this division and get to the postseason. So if you're the Mets, can you look back right now and say, hey, we have a team that can compete with these guys? And clearly the answer is no. Throughout the season last year, I said you could see the writing on the wall that there was a lack of chemistry and there were some culture issues within the Mets clubhouse. Okay. That this was a very tight knit team coming down the stretch in 2024. It did not carry over to 2025. Clearly, things needed to change. But like I said before, I didn't expect the changes to include no longer having a polar bear around. So it's going to be interesting to see what the Mets do for the rest of this offseason. And like I said, the onus right now is on David Stearns. There is no way in the world that he can sit back and not make an impactful move that's going to push the needle and have Met fans sit up in their chairs and say, you know what? We've got a shot. Because right now, with what they have, they don't. But like I said, there's still plenty of time in this offseason for the Mets to go out there. If you're Pete Alonso, like I said, a beloved Met, had a lot of impactful moments in a Mets uniform. And of course, his most memorable hit was arguably Game 3 of the National League wild card round back in 2024. The Mets were down to their last out, and Pete Alonso hit the game-winning 3-run homer off of Devin Williams that sent the Mets past the Brewers into the NLDS. And of course, from there, the Mets beat the Philadelphia Phillies in the NLDS in 4 games before they fell to the Los Angeles Dodgers in the NLCS in 6. But nonetheless, I think definitely there were some hurt feelings by Pete Alonso when it came to the Mets. I feel like it was probably that way with Edwin Diaz as well. But nonetheless, the Mets and all parties involved have clearly decided to go in different directions. And if you're the New York Mets, it's on to 2026, and they have to find a way to make this team relevant. What is David Stearns going to do? We got to sit back and wait and see. But like I said, nothing that he has done so far should get Met fans excited. But like I said, there's still time in the offseason. The onus is on David Stearns because if things don't work out, he's going to be looked at as a guy who let a homegrown fan favorite and another fan favorite walk. So let's see what's in store for the Mets for this rest of this offseason as they look to try to have an impact in 2026. But folks, that's going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank each and every one of you for checking out the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. And as always, if you like what you heard and saw in this podcast, you know what to do. Just hit that like button as well as subscribing to this channel. And like I always say, it is greatly appreciated. Also, if you are on the X, formerly known as Twitter, you can check me out anytime at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you follow me, it will be my pleasure to follow you right back. And that also goes for Instagram, where you can check me out at 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge. Also, if you're on Facebook, definitely check out the Sports Depot 365. And as far as I'm concerned, one of the better sports groups on social media. The Game 82, definitely appreciate the comment. Please don't be a stranger to this channel, and I appreciate the support. And until next time, fine folks, my name is William Martin. I'm signing off, and I'm saying thanks once again for checking out the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. Be well, everybody.